They called it the worst fighter aircraft ever sent to war. British test pilots filed reports recommending it be scrapped entirely. American squadron commanders requested, sometimes demanded, anything else. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, they said, was a failure of engineering, a dangerous compromise, an aircraft that would get its pilots killed. In the spring of 1942, as these assessments circulated through Allied air commands, a Soviet pilot named Aleksandr Pokryshkin climbed into a P-39 cockpit for the first time at an airfield near the Caucasus. He would go on to achieve 59 confirmed victories flying this aircraft. His wingman, Grigory Rechkalov, would claim over 50. Across the Soviet Air Force, the Wojenno-Vzduszne Sily, dozens of pilots would record 30, 40, even 50 kills in the same aircraft Western air forces had rejected as fundamentally unsuitable for combat. The question that emerges from these contradictory assessments is not simply why the aircraft failed in British and American service. The question is why the same aircraft, transferred through Lend-lease to the Soviet Union, became one of the war's most effective fighters in Soviet hands. The answer reveals something profound about aircraft design, tactical doctrine, and the nature of the air war on the Eastern Front. It reveals how an aircraft optimized for one kind of warfare proved catastrophically unsuited for another, and how Soviet pilots, working within entirely different operational parameters, extracted capabilities from the P-39 that its designers had never fully realized. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The P-39's problems, according to Western air forces, were fundamental and unfixable. The aircraft had been designed around a single radical concept, mounting the engine behind the pilot. Bell, Aircraft Corporation's chief designer, Robert Woods, had pursued this configuration to allow a 37mm cannon to fire through the propeller hub. The Oldsmobile-built M4 cannon, derived from an anti-aircraft gun, gave the P-39 hitting power unmatched by any other American fighter of 1941. A single 37mm high-explosive shell could destroy an aircraft. But this design choice created cascading compromises throughout the aircraft's performance envelope. The Allison V-1710 engine sat behind the pilot's seat, connected to the propeller by a 10-foot drive shaft running beneath the cockpit floor. This arrangement placed the aircraft's weight distribution unusually far aft. To compensate, designers moved the cockpit forward and placed the main landing gear in pods extending from the fuselage, creating the distinctive appearance that led to the aircraft's nickname, the Airacobra. The driveshaft itself added weight and complexity. It had to be perfectly balanced and aligned, requiring maintenance, expertise, and spare parts that would prove problematic in forward deployment. More critically, the engine's placement dictated the cooling system's design. Air intakes mounted in the wing roots fed ducting that snaked back to radiators positioned beside the engine. This system worked adequately at low altitude but became increasingly inefficient as the aircraft climbed. The supercharger, which compresses incoming air to maintain engine power at altitude, was specified in the original design but deleted during development to save weight and cost. This single decision would define the P-39's reputation in Western service. Without an effective supercharger, the Allison engine lost power rapidly above 12,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, the P-39's performance degraded noticeably. At 20,000 feet, where much of the air combat over Western Europe occurred, the aircraft was seriously compromised. Above 25,000 feet, it was nearly helpless. British test pilots, flying the aircraft at altitudes where Royal Air Force doctrine expected fighters to operate, found it sluggish, underpowered, and dangerously vulnerable. The Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford conducted exhaustive trials in the summer of 1941. Their report was damning. The aircraft's rate of climb was inadequate above 15,000 feet. Its speed at altitude was inferior to both German fighters and to other Allied types. Its handling characteristics deteriorated as altitude increased, with controls becoming heavy and unresponsive. Most seriously, the aircraft's tendency to tumble in certain flight regimes made it dangerous in the hands of inexperienced pilots. The Royal Air Force had ordered 675 P-39s in 1940, desperately seeking aircraft to replace losses from the Battle of Britain and to build up fighter strength for offensive operations over France. The first aircraft arrived in Britain in July 1941. After evaluation, the RAF accepted delivery of only 80 aircraft. Of these, a single squadron, No. 601 Squadron, flew the type operationally for a brief period. They conducted exactly one offensive sweep over France in October 1941. The mission report noted that German fighters climbed above the P-39s and attacked from superior altitude with impunity. No. 601 Squadron requested replacement aircraft immediately. By December 1941, the RAF had withdrawn the P-39 from operational service entirely. The remaining hundreds of aircraft on order were diverted, many eventually reaching the Soviet Union through Lend-lease. The British assessment was clear and unequivocal. The P-39 was unsuitable for modern air combat. American evaluation reached similar conclusions, though with less absolute rejection. The United States Army Air Forces accepted the P-39 into service, but primarily for training and secondary roles. Fighter groups equipped with P-39s pressed for re-equipment with P-38 Lightnings, P-47s Thunderbolts, or P-51 Mustangs at every opportunity. The 8th Air Force, preparing for strategic bombing operations over Germany, wanted nothing to do with the P-39. The aircraft could not escort bombers at the altitudes where combat would occur. It could not compete with German fighters where they held the altitude advantage. 3 fighter groups flew P-39s in combat in the Mediterranean theater. The 31st, 52nd, and 350th Fighter Groups all reported similar experiences. In missions flown at low to medium altitude, particularly ground attack missions, the P-39 performed adequately. Its 37mm cannon was devastating against ground targets. Its .430 caliber machine guns provided supplementary firepower, but in air-to-air combat against German fighters, particularly at altitude, the P-39 was consistently outperformed. Pilots reported that Messerschmitt Bf-109s could climb above them and dictate engagement terms. They reported that in diving attacks, the P-39's lack of high-altitude performance left them vulnerable and unable to pursue effectively. By mid-1943, all 3 groups had transitioned to other aircraft types. The consensus across American tactical aviation was clear. The P-39 was a failed design that needed to be replaced. This assessment was not merely prejudice or pilot preference. It was based on combat experience and measurable performance data. The P-39's maximum speed at 20,000 feet was approximately 368 miles per hour. The P-47, by comparison, achieved 428 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The P-39's service ceiling was effectively limited to 30,000 feet, while the P-47 could operate above 40,000 feet. Rate of climb above 15,000 feet favored almost every other American fighter type. These were not marginal differences. They were fundamental performance gaps that affected survivability and combat effectiveness. But while Western air forces rejected the P-39, the Soviet Union was requesting more. By 1942, with Lend-lease deliveries beginning to arrive in significant numbers, Soviet fighter regiments were receiving P-39s through the Alaska-Siberia ferry route, through the Persian Corridor, and through the Arctic convoys to Murmansk. Initial Soviet response was mixed. Pilots, accustomed to Soviet fighters, found the P-39 strange. The tricycle landing gear was unfamiliar. The mid-mounted engine created an unusual center of gravity. The cockpit layout, designed for American instrument, standards and procedures, required adjustment. But as Soviet pilots began flying combat missions in the P-39, a different assessment emerged. The aircraft that British and American pilots found inadequate for high-altitude combat over Western Europe proved remarkably well suited to the low-altitude air war over the Eastern Front. The fundamental difference was operational altitude. The air war over Germany and Western Europe occurred primarily between 15,000 and 30,000 feet. Bomber streams flew at 25,000 feet or higher, requiring escort fighters to operate at those altitudes. German fighters climbed to altitude to intercept bomber formations, and Allied fighters had to meet them there. But the air war over the Eastern Front occurred primarily below 10,000 feet, often below 5,000 feet. Ground attack aircraft, the Sturmgewehr and German Stukers, operated at extremely low altitude. Fighters supporting ground forces flew low to maintain visual contact with targets and with the rapidly moving front lines. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized close air support and interdiction at low altitude, rather than strategic bombing requiring high-altitude escort. At altitudes below 12,000 feet, the P-39's performance was entirely adequate. The Allison engine produced full power. The aircraft's speed was competitive with German fighters operating at the same altitude. Its rate of climb was sufficient for intercepts and combat maneuvering. Most importantly, its firepower was overwhelming. The 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub gave Soviet pilots a weapon unlike anything in their previous aircraft. Soviet fighters like the Yak-1 and Lag-3 mounted 20mm cannons or heavy machine guns. The P-39's 37mm cannon was in an entirely different category. A single hit from this weapon could destroy an enemy aircraft. Soviet pilots quickly learned that they did not need to achieve the sustained firing opportunities required by machine guns. A brief burst, a single shell connecting, and the target was finished. This was particularly valuable in the rapid, chaotic, low-altitude combat that characterized the Eastern Front. The Soviet pilot who would most completely vindicate the P-39 in combat was Aleksandr Ivanovich Pokryshkin. Born in 1913 in Novonikolaievsk, later renamed Novosibirsk, Pokryshkin came from a working-class family. His father was a factory worker. The family lived in modest circumstances, typical of industrial workers in Siberia during the early Soviet period. Pokryshkin's path to aviation was not automatic or privileged. He worked as a construction laborer before joining the Soviet Air Force as a ground crew technician in 1932. He served as an aircraft mechanic for years, learning intimate details of aircraft systems, engines, and maintenance procedures, while repeatedly requesting transfer to pilot training. His applications were rejected multiple times. The Soviet Air Force in the 1930s maintained strict criteria for pilot candidates, emphasizing education and political reliability alongside physical fitness. Pokryshkin's working-class background was ideologically favorable, but his limited formal education was an obstacle. He studied at night, completing secondary education while working full-time as a mechanic. Finally, in 1938, he was accepted for pilot training. He completed the course in 1939 and received his assignment to a fighter regiment in Moldova. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Pokryshkin was flying the MiG-3, a high-altitude interceptor that proved problematic in the chaotic low-altitude combat of the war's opening months. He survived the catastrophic early period when the Soviet Air Force lost thousands of aircraft, many destroyed on the ground before they could take off. He flew ground attack missions, escort missions, and intercepts against German bombers and fighters. By the time he transitioned to the P-39 in 1942, he had accumulated considerable combat experience and had developed strong opinions about fighter tactics and aircraft capabilities. His first impression of the P-39 was cautious. The aircraft was foreign, unfamiliar in handling characteristics and systems. Soviet mechanics, accustomed to Lavochkin, Yakovlev, and MiG designs, had to learn entirely new maintenance procedures. Spare parts initially were scarce. Technical manuals arrived in English, requiring translation, but Pokryshkin recognized capabilities that Soviet fighters lacked. The 37mm cannon impressed him immediately. Soviet fighters typically mounted one 20mm cannon or two heavy machine guns. The P-39 carried one 37mm cannon, two 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, and two 30 caliber machine guns in underwing pods. This was concentrated, devastating firepower. The aircraft's radio equipment was reliable, a significant advantage over Soviet fighters where radio communication was often problematic. The P-39 had an SCR-535 radio set as standard equipment, allowing consistent communication between aircraft and with ground controllers. This enabled coordinated tactics that were difficult in Soviet fighters with unreliable or absent radios. The aircraft's cockpit visibility was excellent. The car door-style entry meant the fuselage sides were low, giving the pilot outstanding visibility downward and to the sides. The bubble canopy provided good visibility upward and to the rear. For combat at low altitude, where maintaining visual contact with both enemies and wingmen was critical, this visibility was valuable. Pokryshkin began developing tactics specifically optimized for the P-39's capabilities and the combat conditions of the Eastern Front. He studied German fighter tactics, analyzing their formations and attack methods. He experimented with altitude bands, determining that the P-39 performed optimally between 6,000 and 12,000 feet. Below 6,000 feet, there was insufficient altitude for energy tactics. Above 12,000 feet, performance degraded. Within this altitude band, the P-39 could compete effectively with any German fighter operating at similar altitude. He developed a tactical formation called the Finger 4, which he adapted from German Schwarm tactics observed in combat. 4 aircraft flew in a loose, flexible formation resembling the fingertips of an outstretched hand. Each pilot could cover his wingman while maintaining freedom to maneuver. This formation, combined with radio communication that actually worked, allowed coordinated attacks and mutual support that were impossible with the rigid Soviet 3-ship formations and unreliable radios of earlier years. Pokryshkin emphasized energy management and patience. He taught his pilots to avoid impulsive attacks, wait for the advantageous position, use altitude for energy, convert altitude to speed in the attack, fire the 37mm cannon only when the shot was certain. The weapon carried only 30 rounds. Each round had to count. His methods were controversial. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized aggression and offensive spirit. Pokryshkin's approach, emphasizing patience and calculated positioning, seemed defensive to some commanders, but his results were impossible to argue with. By the end of 1942, his score was climbing steadily. Other pilots in his regiment, flying the same tactics in the same aircraft, were achieving similar success. The moment that crystallized the P-39's potential came during the air battles over the Kuban bridgehead in the spring and summer of 1943. German forces had established positions on the eastern shore of the Kerch Strait, threatening Soviet control of the Caucasus and access to oil fields that were critical to the Soviet war effort. Both sides committed substantial air forces to the battle. The Luftwaffe deployed experienced units equipped with Bf-109G variants and Fw-190 fighters. The Soviet Air Force concentrated fighter regiments, including Pokryshkin's 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, equipped with P-39s. The air combat over the Kuban was intense and sustained. Between April and June 1943, hundreds of sorties were flown daily. German fighters attempted to establish air superiority to support ground operations. Soviet fighters contested this, protecting their own ground attack aircraft and intercepting German raids. The fighting occurred primarily below 10,000 feet, exactly the altitude regime where the P-39 performed best. On April 12, 1943, Pokryshkin led his flight on a mission to intercept German bombers attacking Soviet positions. The formation climbed to 9,000 feet, positioning themselves above the expected approach path. Ground controllers directed them toward an incoming raid, approximately 20 Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, escorted by Bf-109 fighters. Pokryshkin positioned his flight up-sun, the classic fighter advantage. He waited as the German formation approached, watching their positions develop. When the geometry was optimal, he led his flight into a diving attack from the side and slightly behind the German formation. The P-39 accelerated smoothly in the dive. Pokryshkin selected a Stuka that had separated slightly from the formation, lined up the shot, and fired a brief burst from the 37mm cannon. One shell struck the Stuka's fuselage just behind the cockpit. The aircraft disintegrated. Pieces of wing and fuselage tumbled through the air. The Stuka fell in a smoking spiral toward the ground below. His wingmen engaged other targets. Within seconds, 3 more Stukas were falling. The German escort fighters reacted, turning toward the Soviet fighters, but Pokryshkin's flight had already converted their diving speed back into altitude, climbing away from the engagement. The German Bf-109s pursued, but could not close the distance before the Soviet fighters reached safe altitude and turned back toward friendly territory. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. 4 German aircraft destroyed, 0 Soviet losses. This was the pattern Pokryshkin refined throughout the Kuban battles: careful positioning, patient approach, devastating attack, immediate disengagement. The P-39's firepower meant that sustained combat was unnecessary. A single firing pass with good shot placement was sufficient. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Other Soviet pilots were learning similar lessons. Grigory Rechkalov, flying in the same regiment as Pokryshkin, developed a reputation for aggressive attacks and exceptional marksmanship with the 37mm cannon. He achieved his first victories in Soviet fighters, but found his scoring rate increased dramatically after transitioning to the P-39. Nikolai Gulayev, another ace who flew P-39s extensively, described the aircraft as honest and forgiving. It did not have vicious stall characteristics. It did not snap into spins unexpectedly. It gave the pilot clear feedback about its energy state and handling limits. For pilots who understood its capabilities and stayed within its optimal performance envelope, it was reliable and effective. The statistics accumulated through 1943 and 1944 tell the story clearly. Pokryshkin's confirmed victory total climbed: 20 victories by the P-39s ISLs, end of 1942, 30 by mid-1943, 40 by early 1944. Rechkalov's score followed a similar trajectory. Across the Soviet Air Force, regiments equipped with P-39s were recording kill-to-loss ratios that compared favorably with units flying Soviet-built fighters. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, Pokryshkin's unit, claimed over 500 enemy aircraft destroyed during the war. The majority of these victories were achieved in P-39s. Western air forces observed these results with confusion and skepticism. American liaison officers working with Soviet forces sent reports describing the high regard Soviet pilots had for the P-39. These reports contradicted everything American and British tactical aviation had concluded about the aircraft. Some American officers speculated that Soviet victory claims were exaggerated, a common assumption about Eastern Front air combat. Others suggested that the quality of German opposition on the Eastern Front was inferior to that faced in the West, though this explanation was increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence accumulated. The reality was simpler and more profound. The P-39 was not a universal failure. It was a specialized tool that failed when used outside its design parameters and succeeded brilliantly when employed within them. British and American air forces had attempted to use the P-39 as a high-altitude interceptor and escort fighter. In this role, against this requirement, it was inadequate. Soviet forces used the P-39 as a low-altitude air superiority fighter optimized for combat below 12,000 feet. In this role, against this requirement, it was excellent. The aircraft had not changed. The operational requirements and tactical employment had changed, and this made all the difference. By the end of 1944, Aleksandr Pokryshkin had become the second highest scoring Soviet ace of the war, with 59 confirmed victories. His wingman Grigory Rechkalov finished the war with 56 confirmed victories. Both men achieved the majority of their kills, flying the P-39. Nikolai Gulayev, who flew P-39s with the 3rd Fighter Aviation Corps, finished with 57 confirmed victories. Across the Soviet Air Force, at least 20 pilots achieved ace status with 30 or more victories while flying the P-39 predominantly or exclusively. These numbers represented not anomalies, but a pattern. The aircraft that Western air forces had rejected as fundamentally flawed had produced kill ratios and individual scoring records that exceeded most Western fighters in any theater. The Soviet Union received 4,773 P-39s through Lend-lease between 1941 and 1944. This represented nearly half of all P-39 production. The aircraft arrived through three primary routes. The Alaska-Siberia ferry route, known as ALSIB, saw American pilots fly aircraft from factories in the United States to Great Falls, Montana, then to Fairbanks, Alaska, where Soviet pilots took delivery and flew them across Siberia to European Russia. This route delivered over 2,600 aircraft. The Persian Corridor, running through Iran, delivered another 1,000 aircraft. Arctic convoys to Murmansk, despite terrible weather and German naval attacks, delivered hundreds more. Soviet mechanics and ground crews adapted American aircraft to Soviet operational conditions with remarkable ingenuity. They modified engines to run on lower-grade Soviet fuel. They replaced American radio equipment with Soviet sets when American equipment failed and spare parts were unavailable. They winterized aircraft for operations at temperatures that American designers had never considered, adding engine heaters and cold-weather lubricants. They repaired battle damage using salvaged parts from destroyed aircraft, keeping machines flying that American maintenance procedures would have written off as beyond economical repair. Soviet pilots painted aircraft in distinctive camouflage schemes, often adding personal markings and victory tallies. Pokryshkin's aircraft carried a white number 13 on the fuselage, visible to German pilots who learned to avoid combat with that particular P-39. Other aces flew aircraft with elaborate nose art and bright tactical markings. The P-39 became associated in German minds with dangerous, skilled opponents. German pilots fighting on the Eastern Front learned to recognize the P-39's silhouette and to respect the aircraft's capabilities at low altitude. Luftwaffe tactical reports from 1943 and 1944 noted that Soviet fighters, particularly American-supplied types including the P-39, were being flown with increasing skill and aggression. The days when German fighters could dominate Soviet aircraft through superior tactics and training were ending. Soviet pilots had learned, adapted, and were now competing on equal terms with some of the world's most experienced fighter pilots. The contrast with Western experience remained stark. In the Mediterranean theater, where American fighter groups flew P-39s in combat during 1942 and early 1943, the aircraft's record was mediocre. The 31st Fighter Group flew P-39s from late 1942 until April 1943. They claimed approximately 60 enemy aircraft destroyed during this period, while losing 31 P-39s in combat. The 52nd Fighter Group flew P-39s from September 1942 through March 1943. They claimed approximately 40 enemy aircraft while losing 23 P-39s. These were respectable but not exceptional results, and both groups transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts as soon as aircraft were available. American pilots who flew the P-39 in combat generally expressed relief when they transitioned to other types. The P-39 was seen as adequate for ground attack missions, but inferior for air-to-air combat, particularly at altitude. There was no American equivalent to Pokryshkin or Rechkalov, no American pilot who achieved extraordinary success in the P-39. The highest-scoring American P-39 pilot was probably Lieutenant William Shomo, who flew P-39s briefly in the Pacific Theater before transitioning to other aircraft. His total score was modest compared to Soviet aces flying the same aircraft. The disparity was not a matter of pilot quality or courage. American fighter pilots in other aircraft types achieved scores comparable to their Soviet counterparts. Major Richard Bong scored 40 victories in the P-38 Lightning. Major Thomas Maguire scored 38 victories, also in the P-38. Major George Preddy scored 26 victories in the P-51 Mustang. These scores demonstrated that American pilots, when equipped with aircraft suited to their operational requirements, could achieve results matching any air force in the world. The fundamental lesson of the P-39's contradictory service record was not about the aircraft itself. It was about the relationship between design, doctrine, and operational environment. An aircraft is not good or bad in absolute terms. It is effective or ineffective relative to specific requirements in specific conditions. The P-39 was designed around capabilities that proved valuable on the Eastern Front. devastating firepower concentrated in the nose, adequate performance at low altitude, excellent visibility, reliable radio communication, and rugged construction that could withstand damage and rough field operations. These same characteristics proved inadequate for the high-altitude combat that dominated air warfare over Western Europe. Bell Aircraft Corporation, designing the P-39 in the late 1930s, could not have predicted exactly where and how the aircraft would be used. The decision to delete the supercharger during development was driven by cost and weight considerations that seemed reasonable at the time. Fighter doctrine in 1938 and 1939 emphasized speed and firepower over altitude performance. The P-39's revolutionary 37mm cannon represented cutting-edge armament thinking. But by 1941, when the aircraft entered combat service, the operational requirements had evolved. Strategic bombing doctrine required high-altitude escort fighters. Air superiority over Western Europe required fighters that could operate effectively at 20,000 feet and above. The P-39 could not meet these requirements. Soviet operational requirements were different. The Eastern Front air war was primarily a ground support and air superiority, battle fought at low to medium altitude. Strategic bombing played a minimal role. Long-range escort missions were rare. The typical Soviet fighter mission was intercept of German ground attack aircraft, protection of Soviet ground attack aircraft, or air superiority, sweeps over the battlefield. These missions occurred at altitudes where the P-39 performed well. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive attacks and high firepower. The P-39's 37mm cannon fit this doctrine perfectly. Soviet pilots, trained to close to short range before firing, could use the cannon with devastating effect. The aircraft's other characteristics, reliable radio communication and good visibility, enhanced capabilities that were often lacking in Soviet-designed fighters. The success of Soviet P-39 operations validated a principle that would remain relevant throughout the history of military aviation. An aircraft's effectiveness depends not just on its design, but on how it is employed. The same machine that failed in one tactical context became a war winner in another. This was not a matter of propaganda or exaggerated claims. It was documented through combat records, victory confirmations, and the testimony of both Soviet pilots who flew the aircraft and German pilots who fought against it. Western air forces, which had rejected the P-39 based on their operational requirements, were correct within their context. Soviet forces, which embraced the same aircraft, were equally correct within theirs. After the war, when military analysts began assessing aircraft effectiveness across different theaters, the P-39's contradictory record presented a puzzle. How could the same aircraft be simultaneously a failure and a success? The answer required understanding the specific conditions of Eastern Front air combat. German fighters on the Eastern Front faced different challenges than those in the West. In the West, Luftwaffe units defending Germany against Allied bombing raids had to intercept high-altitude bomber formations. They needed high-altitude performance and heavy firepower to destroy four-engine bombers. Aircraft and tactics optimized for this mission were not necessarily optimal for low-altitude combat over the Eastern Front. In the East, German fighters primarily supported ground operations, attacked Soviet ground attack aircraft, and contested air superiority at low altitude. The Bf-109 variants that equipped most German fighter units on the Eastern Front performed well at low altitude, but so did the P-39. Soviet pilots exploited the P-39's strengths systematically. They avoided combat at high altitude, where German fighters had performance advantages. They used their excellent visibility and reliable radios to coordinate attacks. They maximized the effectiveness of the 37mm cannon by developing tactics that created high-probability shooting opportunities. Pokryshkin's tactical innovations, particularly his adaptation of the Finger 4 formation and emphasis on energy management, became standard practice in Soviet fighter units. These tactics were not aircraft-specific, but they were particularly effective in the P-39, which had the performance characteristics and firepower to execute them successfully. The industrial context mattered as well. The Soviet Union received P-39s as Lend-lease aid. essentially free aircraft that supplemented domestic production. Soviet factories were producing Yak and Lavochkin fighters in large numbers, but these aircraft had their own limitations. The P-39 provided capabilities Soviet designs lacked, particularly in firepower and radio communication. For Soviet military planners, the P-39 was not a replacement for domestic fighters, but a complement to them, filling specific roles where its capabilities were valuable. American military planners viewed the same aircraft as a failed design that needed to be replaced as quickly as possible. Both assessments were rational, given their different operational requirements and industrial contexts. Aleksandr Pokryshkin survived the war and became one of the Soviet Union's most decorated military heroes. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award 3 times, the only fighter pilot to achieve this honor during the war. He continued serving in the Soviet Air Force after the war, eventually reaching the rank of Marshal of Aviation. He wrote several books about fighter tactics and air combat, emphasizing the principles he had developed flying the P-39. He died in 1985, respected as one of the greatest fighter pilots of the Second World War. Grigory Rechkalov also survived the war, received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award twice, and continued military service until retirement. He died in 1990, having witnessed the end of the Soviet Union and the transformation of the military he had served. The P-39 itself disappeared from service quickly after the war ended. Soviet units transitioned to jet fighters in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The P-39s, worn out from combat service and difficult to maintain without American spare parts, were scrapped or relegated to training duties. Few survived. Today, only a handful of P-39s exist in museums worldwide. The aircraft that Soviet pilots flew to some of the war's highest individual victory totals has largely vanished from physical existence, remembered primarily through combat records and veterans' accounts. The story of the P-39's service reveals how context determines effectiveness in warfare. British test pilots at Duxford in 1941 were not wrong when they concluded the aircraft was unsuitable for Royal Air Force operations. American fighter pilots requesting P-47s and P-51s instead of P-39s were not wrong about what they needed for combat over Germany. Soviet pilots who praised the P-39 and achieved extraordinary success flying it were not exaggerating or benefiting from inferior opposition. All these assessments were simultaneously correct because they described the same aircraft in fundamentally different operational environments. The machine that could not escort bombers at 25,000 feet over Germany excelled at low-altitude combat over the Eastern Front. The firepower that seemed excessive for dogfighting proved perfect for the brief, violent engagements that characterized Soviet tactical doctrine. In the end, the P-39's legacy is not about the aircraft itself, but about the nature of military effectiveness. There is no universal measure of combat capability independent of mission requirements and operational conditions. The best aircraft, the best tactic, the best strategy is always contextual, always dependent on specific circumstances. The Luftwaffe called the P-39 a failure based on their experience fighting it in certain conditions. Soviet pilots called it excellent based on their experience using it in different conditions. Both were correct. Both were describing reality as they experienced it. And somewhere between these contradictory assessments lies a truth about warfare that transcends any single aircraft or battle. That effectiveness is not absolute but relative, not universal but contextual, and that success depends not just on having good equipment, but on using that equipment in ways that match its capabilities to the demands of the mission. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.